Remarks from Libya's president.
Assembly, I have the honor to welcome to the United Nations His Excellency Mohammed El Magarief, President of the General National Congress of Libya, and to invite him to address the Assembly.
In
the name of God, the Merciful, the Compassionate, Mr. President, Majesties, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, it is my pleasure at the outset to express my congratulations to Mr. Vuk Jeremic on his election to the presidency of the General Assembly. I should also like to commend Mr. Nasser Abdelaziz Al-Nasr for his leadership at last year's session. I should also like to express our sincere gratitude and appreciation to Mr. Ban Ki-moon, Secretary General of the United Nations, for all the efforts he is making to realize the Charter's objectives and purposes. Mr. President, 3 years ago, a despot who ruled my country for 42 years with oppression and an iron fist, he stood on this very rostrum and tore a copy of the Charter of the United Nations, saying he did not recognize the authority of that document. Today, I'm standing on the very same rostrum, affirming my country's support of the Charter of the United Nations and our respect for it. I stand before you today, before the entire world, to apologize for all the harm, all the crimes committed by that despot against so many innocents, to apologize for the extortion and terrorism he meted on so many states. I should like to stress that the Libyan people is determined to build a state that respects its neighbors, one that respects its international commitment, and believes that genuine peace in the world will not be realized unless the conscience of every individual is focused on peace. Libya shall be a land of peace and security and a force for peace. Mr. President, I am speaking today before this August Assembly to bring you the greetings of the Libyan people, a people that arose on February 17th of 2011 in a comprehensive, explosive revolution that shook the very foundations of the regime of the lunatic despot Muammar al-Gaddafi, who declared that he will burn Libya, would destroy Libya and make it swim in a bloodbath. He killed thousands of civilians, recruited mercenaries from everywhere, crossed every value, and ordered his militias and mercenaries to rape minors, one who destroyed cities. But our people did not kneel, did not back down. Thousands of martyrs were lost among the wounded and the lost. The price of freedom was a price in blood, lives, amputated limbs, and lost youth. Mr. President, from this place, on behalf of the Libyan people, I greet the Organization of the United Nations that stood by our people, by our will for freedom against bloodlust and nihilism, one that adopted resolutions 1970 and 1973 in the Security Council to protect the innocents in Libya against crimes against humanities and violations of human rights. Mr. President, I stand before you today representing the Libyan people, a people that is building the institutions of democracy following the fall of dictatorship. The world has witnessed the first free, transparent elections in Libya, where the General National Council was elected. One, I was honored to be elected as its leader. The world, through these United Nations, gave us complete, genuine support for that achievement. In our revolution for freedom and in the challenge of establishing democracy, the conscience of the world was with us, both in deeds and in thoughts. Support was offered from everyone and from everywhere. Among those offering help was Ambassador Chris Stevens, a voice of reason and conscience, a man of love, a messenger of friendship who came to Libya following the outbreak of our freedom revolution, one who touched the people's feelings, who traveled from Tripoli to the Western Mountain and back and all across Libya. Chris Stevens spoke with everyone in Arabic, always smiled and showed care. This human diplomat has found his place in the consciousness of the Libyan people. It was a day of sadness throughout Libya when he was assassinated along with his 3 aides. We would like to express our deepest condolences to the American people for this grave loss. It was a loss for Libya as it was a loss for the United States of America. We stress to the United States, its government, and its people that this catastrophe will only increase our solidarity to entrench the hopes and objectives in which Ambassador Chris Stevens believed. We shall defeat the plots of the backward terrorists that do not represent Libya, who do not represent Islam. Islam is a religion of tolerance, peace and love. Just as President Obama said from this rostrum 2 days ago, our future is a future that will be charted by people like Chris Stevens, not by people like his killers. In this context, I would like to express my condolences to the Libyan people and to Misrata for the death of Jum'a Shaban, who has joined the long list of martyrs some 5 days ago. Mr. President, I would like to express our deep appreciation for the understanding showed by the U.S. administration following that incident. Let me stress that my country is determined to pursue the perpetrators and to bring them to justice. We shall make our utmost to strengthen the necessary protection granted diplomatic and consular missions and to ensure the safety of their employees and facilities. This painful event in no way expresses the feelings of the Libyan people, a people of moderation, hospitality and gratitude. Perhaps the large demonstrations condemning this perfidious crime in the city of Benghazi and other Libyan cities is best proof of the true feelings of the Libyan people and their full rejection of all forms of violence and extremism. Libya shall never be home to extremist groups. We shall always be a peaceful Muslim country, one of moderation. Mr. President, the new Libya shall be based on democracy, openness, transparency, combating corruption, enabling women and youth. It will be a Libya by all and for all. At the same time, I cannot fail to condemn the anti-Islam campaigns and those defaming his prophet. Such campaigns increase hatred. They aim at provocation and tension in relations among civilizations. They go beyond the concept of free expression. This makes it necessary for the General Assembly of the United Nations to adopt a covenant in order to criminalize the insulting of the symbols of all religions, and we as Muslims believe fully in the unity of mankind, of the brotherhood of man, and we express our support for dialogue between religions and cooperation, tolerance and humanitarian values. And therefore my country supports all efforts being made within the dialogue between civilizations, cultures and religions within the United Nations and other organizations. Mr. President, since the revolution of 17 February 2011, Libya has witnessed an uprising by the Libyan people against social injustice and political oppression. This did not stop at merely changing the dictatorial ruling regime. Indeed, it went forward towards a full transformation to a genuine democratic system based on the respect and promotion of human rights, multi-party political system, the peaceful handing over of power, and a commitment to the principles and norms of international law as well as the Charter of the United Nations. Perhaps you have followed the consecutive political developments in Libya in the past few months on the road to democratic transformation, the rebuilding of state institutions, the election of the General National Congress that will, through a constituent assembly, draft the permanent constitution of Libya, the creation of the first provisional government following elections that were fully democratic as witnessed by international observers. We shall work to rebuild, to reorganize and reform state institutions, particularly the police force, the national army and the judiciary, and we shall also work to implement various programs to disarm demobilize and reintegrate the revolutionaries in the defense and interior ministries as well as other state institutions. For the first time since independence, we have political parties in the political arena. There is freedom of expression and the press. There is freedom, unconditional freedom to demonstrate, freedom of association, freedom to set up civil institutions, unions, as well as political and social, intellectual organizations without any limitations. This has led to a free dialogue and effective participation by all peoples in all parts of the world. Mr. President, the period of the previous regime for more than 4 decades saw flagrant violations of human rights, acts of torture, detention without trial, extrajudiciary killing, forced disappearance, mistreatment, humiliation of citizens. When the revolution erupted on 17 February through peaceful demonstrations, the previous regime faced them down with bullets and oppression in a grave violation of international humanitarian law and human rights law. Hence, the Human Rights Council suspended Libya's membership in said council, set up an international fact-finding commission, and expressed the condemnation of the international community for such violations. That commission did certify violations of human rights by the regime forces and violations on the hands of some revolutionaries. And therefore, the Libyan authorities have taken the human rights file to a higher level. Mr. President, some wonder, was the Arab Spring worthy of support? To them, I would say, would it have been better for the corrupt dictatorial regimes to remain in place for decades more, oppressing, meting out injustice, arbitrary treatment, corruption, and the violation of the most fundamental human rights? Should they have been allowed to continue pillaging the wealth of the peoples, leading some among those oppressed people to extremism, and follow some with a particular agenda that goes against peace and security, ones who resort to terrorism and violence? Democracy did not come to France following the French Revolution a year or even a decade following the revolution. Indeed, this was the case in other states of the world that gained their freedom. This was followed by instability and sometimes very long, bloody civil wars. Mr. President, at this new stage of building the new Libya, we face threats and challenges that are very serious and threaten national and regional security because of illegitimate acts by Gaddafi's sons and some elements of the previous regime who are wanted by the law and have found a safe harbor in some neighboring countries, and others who are committing criminal acts threatening security and stability in in Libya. We also face other security threats, drug trafficking, the trafficking of psychotropic drugs, illegal immigration, the trafficking of weapons. As you know, the nature and scope of these threats to national security and our borders requires a bilateral as well as multilateral response to promote and strengthen national efforts. And therefore, in last March, my country hosted the regional ministerial ministerial conference on the security of borders, and a plan of action, the Tripoli plan of action, was adopted in order to consult and share information and expertise on the security of borders. Among our national priorities is Libya's right to restitution of monies that were pillaged from the treasury and secreted to outside the country, ones that are being used to finance criminal acts and activities in order to destabilize Libya and threaten its security. This also affects neighboring countries, and we would therefore call on all our friends to ensure the special rights to Libyan investments as well as to the properties of the Libyan states in other countries, not to touch them, and particularly in some countries in Africa, Latin America and Asia, where those funds have been subject to some coercive measures by some governments. In this context, we call on all states of the world to cooperate to combat corruption and money laundering. We call on financial institutions, and particularly in some Western countries and some islands, to bear their responsibilities and not to accept suspicious funds, and particularly from third world dictators who are bleeding the wealth of their peoples and hide those funds under fictitious companies. In March of 2010, the World Financial Integrity, Global Financial Integrity issues a report estimating that the offshore gross deposit was $10 trillion US dollars. We look forward to the signing and ratification of an anti-corruption convention by 130 states. We believe this would promote cooperation among states to combat corruption and to restitute stolen funds. So we also support the United Nations Convention Against Corruption. It is the first convention of its kind. It is binding legally and internationally by Chapter 8 and Articles from 1 to 71. And in this context, I must pay tribute to the great contribution of the mission, including its leader Ian Martin, despite the many challenges and difficulties. This is natural and to be expected in the transitional phase. We also welcome the appointment of Mr. Mitri as new head of the mission, and we look forward to further cooperation and are committed to providing all facilities to him in his mission. Mr. President, Libya is committed to respect of all its commitments in all international instruments on disarmament and the maintenance of international peace and security. We are fully prepared to cooperate transparently and sincerely with the international community to support efforts, both regional and international, to implement the provisions of international agreements and protocols in order to create an international environment that would make progress towards ridding the world definitively of weapons of mass destruction. We are also determined to review all other international instruments to which we are not party and to take the appropriate decision thereon as soon as the Constitution is adopted and a government and parliament elected. We condemn Israel's measures in attempting to Judaize the occupied land and its violations of human rights, international humanitarian law. This calls on the international community to take its responsibilities by taking urgent, strong measures to put an end to Israeli aggression and assure full protection to Palestinians, as well as a radical solution to the question of Palestine through a durable settlement, assuring the withdrawal of Israel from all occupied lands and the return of all Palestinian refugees to their homes, the establishment of the independent state of Palestine with Al-Quds as its capital in accordance with relevant international resolutions. The suffering of the Syrian people is unimaginable. The regime in power is repressing its citizens violently, shedding their blood and honor. This has caused the regime to lose its legitimacy. In order to put an end to such a tragedy, Libya urges the Security Council to act promptly in accordance with the principle of responsibility to protect and take immediate action to end all forms of murder, violence and destruction and find a way out of this crisis through a peaceful transition of power. In order to ensure the legitimate demands of the Syrian people, this has not been achieved so far. However, with consensus among member states in the Security Council and by supporting the efforts of the joint envoy of the United Nations, of the Arab League and the United Nations, this may be obtained. Libya condemns social and political injustice, harassment and killing against the Muslim minority in Myanmar on ethnic and religious bases. This is a flagrant violation of international human rights. We call all relevant institutions to immediately intervene to put an end to this tragedy. We underlined the necessity of forming an international committee of inquiry to identify those responsible for such violence and killings and bring them to justice and ensure the right of compensation to victims. Mr. President, our countries convene annually in this forum ever since the United Nations was established in order to reflect on the achievement of the objectives set out in its charter. We have made many achievements and many challenges remain, such as reform of the United Nations, the world of weapons of mass destruction, reduction of poverty, ignorance and disease, wars and armed conflicts, fighting terrorism and organized crime, the protection of the environment, achieving sustainable development, a respect for human rights, and mainly the rights of women, and ensuring the rule of law, fighting against racism, hatred, and intolerance. Mr. President, Libya emphasizes its affiliation to Africa, the importance of shifting its policies and relations with Africa and the world, ones which were based in the past on personal choices and extortion. We want them to be relations based on a firm basis for the interest of all the peoples. The new Libya dissociates itself from the repugnant past and extends its hand in freedom and friendship to initiate new relations built on mutual respect and fruitful cooperation. In conclusion, Excellencies, Mr. President, let me wish this session full success in solving the issues on our agenda. I express the hope that a spirit of solidarity and cooperation will prevail in order to create a better world, one blessed with security and stability. Thank you, and may God's blessing be upon you.
On behalf of the General Assembly, I wish to thank the President of the General National Congress of Libya for the statement just made. May I request representatives to remain seated while we greet the President.